Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody can hear me loud and clear. My name is Ra Mason. I'm a lecturer here at the University of East Anglia in the School of Politics, Philosophy, Language and Communication. I'm welcoming you here today on behalf of the CJS seminar, Centre for Japanese Studies seminar series. And we are extremely excited today to have with us a distinguished professor and a close friend of mine who has worked closely with myself and Professor Muminov here at UEA and in Tohoku to bring together the two universities and to explore the global reach of Japanese studies. And Professor Kabashima, who is going to speak for us today, is a professor of law. He is has a specialization in constitutional law and comparative study of constitutional law, but he is also a very talented and diverse scholar, I should say, and has a great range and wealth of knowledge, particularly across kind of German literature and a great understanding of comparative philosophical and legal approaches between, if you like, the East and the West, particularly Europe and Japan. So really very, very lucky to have him with us today to speak. And without further ado, I would like to pass over, but just before I do that, I would also like to say a special thank you to Dr. Sherzod Muminov, who has been our organizer, and to the CJS seminar team, and also a special personal thank you to Professor Kabashima, who has worked so hard to bring our two universities together and visited the UEA campus in 2018 and has welcomed us back in Tohoku in 2018 and 2019. So hopefully when this horrible pandemic has subsided, we can pick up that relationship once again. So I will hand over to Professor Kabashima now and look forward to a very interesting looking talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ra, for a warm introduction, and good afternoon, my ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to have this wonderful opportunity to talk with you at the CJS research webinar, Simsbury Institute, University of East Anglia. I'd like to express all my gratitude for the hosts and organizers, Dr. Sherzod Muminov, alongside Dr. Ra Mason, who both came to the conference hosted in Sendai 2 years ago, as Ra mentioned, and they delivered outstanding lectures on Japanese studies, Ra about international relationships surrounding Japan and Okinawa, and Sherzod about Japanese prisoners of war in Siberia in a post-war proceeding. I enjoyed so much the discussion with my good friends, and therefore I'm very glad to be able to continue our academic dialogue today. Thank you very much. And I'd like to show you my own slide here, and how can it work? No? I don't know. So maybe how can I show you my slide? Can you tell me, Ra?
You should have a share screen button on the bottom of the screen, a green share screen button. So if
yeah, but it is said it's void.
Oh, really?
You make it void, yeah.
Let's see if I can allow it. Okay, there we go. That should be okay now.
Oh, I uploaded my slide in a chat function, and can you download and can you show it?
I can certainly.
On your side.
Do you want to try and share your screen?
No, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah,
okay.
It's working. Yeah, no, okay. It's okay. Thank you. And can you see my OE?
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's perfect.
Does it working?
Yes, very, very, very well.
Oh, yeah. In my sorry. How does it work? Ah, yeah, in my side, and I can't Nasui. Okay, it works. Okay.
Yeah, it's working perfectly. Perfectly.
Okay, then I continue my talk then. And before entering into the topics today, then I'd like to introduce myself shortly, as shown in the slide. I was born in Nagasaki more than 50 years ago, and studied law to the master level at Kyoto about 30 years ago, and studied philosophy for PhD in Germany about 20 years ago. My chair at the law department is named jurisprudence, which may sound unfamiliar to you. So I'd like to explain it at first. The literal meaning of jurisprudence is the combination of juris, that is law or right, and prudence, that is wisdom. But as one of the legal studies, it means philosophical consideration about law and right. In other words, philosophy of law, which covers mainly three topics. Firstly, general theory of law, equivalent to ontology in philosophy. Secondly, theory of justice, equivalent to ethics. And finally, legal method, equivalent to epistemology. I want to discuss today Japanese rule of law and representative democracy from a justice point of view above all. Then in the first part of my presentation, I'd like to start with clarifying my methodological standpoint, how to analyze and understand the Japanese rule of law and representative democracy. To mention in advance, my position is so-called idealism, represented by German philosophers like Kant and Hegel, as you see those names in this slide. I think that there are two basic positions in the methodology of humanities and social science which are contradicting each other, namely British empiricism and German idealism. I hope that it might be meaningful to show you the difference between both positions in a rough but a clear way as follows. In the empiricist approach, you would start with the premise that the fact determines the idea. Concretely spoken, the nature of the world and especially the nature of human in terms of his needs, wants, interests, desires, and so on. These given facts set the cognitive framework for human to understand what is the world and how to behave in it. This is the empiricist position. In the idealist approach, to the contrary, starting point is that the idea determines the fact. Even though this might sound strange, you could be clear if you would think of your daily life. For example, when you see a coin, you don't take it as a piece of metal, but as money. And also in your behavior in a daily life, you surely judge what is good and what is wrong according to your idea. For example, when you eat a lunch in an Italian restaurant, you might order a bowl of salad rather than a pizza because you think it is good for your health. Again, in the idealist approach, the idea determines the fact. In this way, the idealist position accepts the evidence that the human and his world consists of ideas and not just materials. This is my methodological standpoint. I'd like to mention Immanuel Kant, one of the most prominent idealists. Though I cannot enter into details of the famous Kantian formulation of categorical imperative because of the limitation of time, I'd like to focus on his concept of regulative ideas, which are drawn from the categorical imperative. So far as a human is equipped with a practical reason, it is necessary for him to recognize those moral essentials like human dignity and freedom. It is a matter of course that human dignity and freedom cannot be completed in the real world because it should be coordinated among the people. But the idea of human dignity and freedom serves an essential function as a moral compass to guide a human through the long way of living. Even in a dark time, if you keep an eye on Polaris, you will never lose your way, otherwise you will not know what to do where you are anymore. The regulative ideas determine the reality in this way. This is my interpretation of Kantian moral philosophy. Another giant of German idealism is Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He tried to develop the idealist concept by overcoming the Kantian dualism. between idea and reality, mind and body, Oucht-to and being, norm and fact. So he created his own dialectic that was not a formal logic but a practical one. Starting point is the reality named thesis. So far as a human is equipped with a practical reason, a human is capable of critical thinking. The second phase is named antithesis because the idea is basically related to negation of the reality. So far as a human has a critical idea on his mind, he will take action to improve the reality. So in the third phase of synthesis, the thesis and the antithesis, the reality and the idea are integrated through the human action. I'd like to give you a very banal example for the dynamism of Hegelian dialectic. If you find yourself not smart enough, you create an ideal image of your own as a smart one. So far as you see yourself as an essentially smart one, you will work hard to learn math or a foreign language or whatever you like. In 1 month or in 1 year, you will be the one who you took before as ideal. Hegel thought that every human event can be understood in this way of dialectic dynamism. I'd like to adapt this way of understanding to describe the historical development of Japanese rule of law and representative democracy today. And in the second part of my talk, I'd like to show you an overview of a historical Japanese constitutionalism. Among the specialists of Japanese studies, it is well known that the Japanese modernity started with the Meiji Restoration in 1868. But I'd like to set the starting point with the Opium War between the United Kingdom and the Qing dynasty of China in 1840 to 42, because the Nanjing Treaty, to conclude it, was the model of unequal treaty between a major power and a less developed country at the time, which was adopted later also to relationships of Japan with major powers. So in the same way as Qing dynasty, Japanese Tokugawa shogunate was forced to conclude an unequal treaty with the United States in 1858, which threatened Japan with the overwhelming force of the frigates called black ships. It was the direct cause of the Meiji Restoration in 1868, when the Meiji Emperor took power of the Tokugawa shogunate. Therefore, the newly established Meiji government set the goal of its public policy to revise the unequal treaties with the major powers to fair ones. For this purpose, the Japanese government at the time took it as necessary to modernize the Japanese society so as to introduce the modern legal system of rule of law and constitutionalism. So the foundational statutes of constitutional law and civil code were approved in 1889 and 1896 respectively. But the major powers agreed with revision of treaties with Japan not until Japan won the victory over China in 1895 and over Russia in 1905. This was a bad lesson for the Japanese policy to be driven later to colonialism and military expansion policy. The constitution of the Great Japanese Empire adopted the quasi-constitutional monarchy as shown in the slide, but there were no democratic control over the government, nor judicial control over administration, no civilian control over the military provided in it. Even though the competence of the emperor was bound in the constitution, the Japanese constitutionalism at the time was not guaranteed with the check and balance mechanism based on separation of powers. Mainly because the dysfunction of constitutional system and also the meaningless spiritualism of the Japanese mindset, the Japanese government, together with its military, lost the Pacific War against the Allied powers in 1945. The chief commander of the Allied powers, General MacArthur, dictated 3 principles to democratize the Japanese constitution. Firstly, people's sovereignty and the emperor just as a symbol of them. Secondly, demilitarization and renunciation of war. And thirdly, guarantee of equal human rights and abolishing feudal relations in a society. You can see the basic structure of the current Japanese constitution enacted in 1947 under the military occupation of the Allied powers. It is remarkable that the current Japanese constitution adopts the British Westminster model in a check and balance mechanism, which means that the majority leader of the lower house takes power of the government, though the draft was written by the US military officers in the governmental section of the occupational power. In terms of the judicial control over legislation and administration, to the contrary, the American model was adopted, in which the Supreme Court decides whether the statute or an administrative act is constitutional in accordance with human rights or not. This American model can be compared with the Austrian, or rather Kelsenian model, in which there is a special instance of constitutional court which rules constitutionality independently of the Supreme Court. In the third part, I'd like to turn to the idea side so as to see what attitude the Japanese intellectuals took to the new constitutionalism introduced by the military power of the United States. I want to pick up 3 authors seeing it positively and 2 others taking it as something deficient. The first one is Maruyama Masao, political philosopher who published the book Japanese Thoughts in 1961. He criticized the imperial ruling based on Meiji Constitution in 3 points. Firstly, while the political power was concentrated to the emperor himself should not take any responsibility for politics because he was sacred. Secondly, the prime minister was not the chief of the cabinet, but each minister was responsible directly to the emperor. In this way, the government did not take any responsibility for its policy directly to the people. Thirdly, as the emperor lacked political responsibility and the government lacked democratic responsibility, the Meiji Constitution set up the irresponsible system of imperial power. This system didn't work at all in the first 2 decades of Showa era, when the Japanese politics fell into autocracy, despotism, and totalitarianism. From this critical point of view, Maruyama was delighted to welcome the new democratic constitution, which makes it possible for the politics to take responsibility directly to the people. The second author is historian of economy, Otsuka Hisao, who published the book The Human in the Social Science in 1977. Otsuka focused on the view of human as the foundation for the Japanese society to develop economically as well as politically. He pointed out that the human was traditionally understood in Japan in relation with his social status, especially in a feudal relationship in the form of clan, caste, class, etc. In the Western societies, to the contrary, the human was regarded and recognized as an equal and autonomous individual who took responsibility to himself. Such individuals, as appearing in the figure of Robinson Crusoe, supported the democratic process in a civil society. In this comparison between Western and Japanese view of human, Otsuka made reference to Max Weber's discussion about Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. So he insisted that the traditional ethos of Confucianism and Buddhism was not adequate for the modernization process, but the secular and ascetic ethos of Puritan was indispensable for economical and political development of the Japanese society. The third important author who positively saw the Japanese new constitution is the jurist and civil law scholar Kawashima Takeyoshi, who published the book Japanese Legal Sense in 1967. He compared in his book the Japanese governmental principle and the Western one. He criticized the traditional Japanese society for the rule by human and the governmental authority for the arbitrary use of power with no guarantee of human rights. The Western society, especially Great Britain, to the contrary, has established the principle of rule of law for so long as Henry Bracton expressed it in his book published in the 13th century. Kawashima was delighted to welcome the new constitution, recognizing the private property and human rights as the basic for establishing rule of law in Japan. As seen above, Maruyama, Otsuka, and Kawashima approved the new constitutionalism, rule of law, and democracy in the first 2 decades after the World War II. To the contrary, there were also intellectuals who were skeptical about Western model of government. Firstly, for Hashikawa Bunzo, who discussed Japanese Romanticism in 1960, modernization of the Japanese society was not equal to rationalization of socio-political system. He pointed out that even in Western societies, there were also skeptical attitudes about the idea of enlightenment combined with phenomena like bourgeois society, industrialization, bureaucracy, technocracy, or rational thinking. Especially the intellectual movement of decadence and fin de siècle in France and Romanticism in Germany extended its influence over the Japanese intellectuals. Hashikawa insisted, therefore, that the critical attitude combined with traditional value was also indispensable for the Japanese modern development. Another critical thinker was Aida Yuji, who was held captive as a prisoner of war in a camp in Arlon, near Yangon, Burma or Myanmar, by the British Army for 2 years after the World War II. He experienced that the British military, as well as civilians, behaved in Burma like tyrannies, abusing violence not only toward Japanese prisoners, but also toward colonized Burmese people. He saw the idea of humanism, human rights, and human dignity as being only valid for Western people, but not for Asian. He thought that Western people spoke beautiful words for humanism just in order to excuse for imperialistic aggression and world dominion. In the next part, I'd like to talk about the recent 3 decades of the Japanese politics and law. In the late 1980s to 1990s, it became obvious that the Japanese politics was heavily contaminated by the systemic corruption of so-called Iron Triangle. This means that the Japanese constitutionalism, including rule of law and democracy, didn't work so well as Maruyama, Otsuka, and Kawashima imagined. And it didn't develop in such a way to the ideal of Japanese tradition like Hashikawa and Aida thought of either. Japanese government became corrupt in the way as follows. Japanese major companies established Japan Business Federation, named Keidanren, that donated a huge amount to the Conservative Party, LDP, Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, in order to finance its election campaign. In exchange for the donation, LDP brought huge profits for the big business through its control over the governmental bureaucrats who had to obey the politicians for success in their career. This corrupt Iron Triangle was revealed to be serious, especially after the bubble economy ended in 1991. The reason for the structural corruption was identified in the electoral system constructed of the so-called middle-scale districts, in which, namely, each constituency included 3 to 5 seats of the lower house, so the majority LDP won nearly 2/3 of the seats, while the minority socialists got just 1/3 of the seats in every general election at the time. Because there was no transition of power in this electoral system, the corruption within the Iron Triangle was gradually accumulated. This was the background of the Electoral Reform in 1994, which introduced parallel voting system to make regime change possible and public policy rational. I will mention the practice of the current electoral system later. The initiative for this electoral reform was undertaken by Professor Sasaki Takeshi, then at University Tokyo, who later expressed his intention and evaluated the contemporary Japanese democracy in his book, Mind of Politics, published in 2009. He insists that the current electoral system is appropriate, constructed of the parallel voting system in which the single-member districts and the proportional representatives are combined. He regards this electoral system as good because it enables the leadership democracy, especially in the political circumstances of Japan, where the common people are ignorant and indifferent of politics in general. Therefore, he thinks the Japanese people need a strong leadership of professional politicians who are aware of political responsibility for the people. From this standpoint, Sasaki expects a strong leader to appear from the LDP, like the former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who is capable of discussing openly with specialists and making rational decisions based on the professionalism. It is here remarkable to me that Sasaki does not mention anymore the transition of power through election as originally conceptualized at the reform. The current electoral system is shown in the slide. This is the parallel voting system in which every voter has 2 ballots in the election. Then he casts the 1 ballot for the single-member constituency and the other for the proportional representatives. The Japanese lower house consists of 465 members in total, among which 176 seats are for proportional representatives and 289 for single-member districts. In the election, the voters have to vote in person, either at the poll on the election day or earlier at the voting center, as voting by mail is permitted just for exceptional voters like disabilities, elderly in need of care, and voters living in a foreign country. This slide shows the overview of the current Japanese government in 3 distributed powers. The chief of administration is the Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide since last September, who leads his cabinet composed of 20 members besides himself. The Prime Minister is at the same time the majority leader of the lower house. The coalition of the conservative LDP and the Buddhist party Komeito is the majority in both of the lower house and the upper house. In terms of the judiciary, the highest instance is the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice is Otani Naoto. Among 50 judges in the Supreme Court, only 2 are female. In terms of education, 9 judges are graduated from University Tokyo, 2 from Tohoku, my school, and each one from Rikkyo, Hitotsubashi, Kyoto, and Waseda. We can see here the elite and paternalist structure in the Japanese legal system. As mentioned in the last slide, the current situation of the Supreme Court, I'd like to go further onto the legal reform undertaken for recent 2 decades and finally implemented last year, 2020. The chair of the Civil Law Reform Commission, Professor Uchida Takashi, then at University Tokyo, explains that the civil law reform aims at making contract rules easy to understand for the normal people. This sounds nice, but substantially questionable whether contract law can be formulated for the usual people to understand easily or not. Maybe therefore, he doesn't forget to additionally remark that the contract law should be revised in order to be applied also to international cases in trade and business, especially in globalizing Asian markets. This makes a difference because the contract rules are related to the conditions for growth of the Japanese national economy. Another commission member, Professor Omura Atsushi, also at University Tokyo, does not hesitate to acknowledge that it is difficult for the people to understand the civil law because it requires a certain amount of expertise at any rate. Therefore, the civil law scholars and specialists like Omura and Uchida should and will represent the general interest of the people. Accordingly, he thinks that it is not necessary for the people to participate in the process of civil law reform at all. In the final part, I'd like to show you my own critical comments to the current reality and the discussion about democracy and the rule of law. I start with the reality level. Since the electoral reform in 1994, the transition of power has occurred only once, namely the administration of Democratic Party, Hatoyama administration and Kan Naoto administration, just for 3 years, from 2009 to 2012. For the rest 23 years, LDP has kept holding the power. I ask myself whether the Japanese democracy works well even when we hear of the lost 3 decades of the Heisei era. My doubt can be supported by the statistics of the voter turnout. At the last general election of the House of Representatives in 2017, the voter turnout was 53.68%, about 54%, while in the election of the House of Councillors in 2019, it was 48.8%, according to the official announcement of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Compared with the US presidential election in 2020 with the turnout of 66.7%. At this point, Sasaki's suggestion is correct that the Japanese common people are ignorant and indifferent of the politics. Here I'd like to move the idea level. Even though Sasaki understands correctly the Japanese political situation, I don't agree with his solution at all. I find it better and more reasonable to encourage the people to join in the democratic process for the sake of democracy than to strengthen the leadership democracy as Sasaki recommends. I can find out the similar problem in Uchida's and Omura's attitude. Even if it might be inevitable for the law scholars to carry out the civil law reform based on their expertise, it is regrettable that they don't see, Uchida and Omura don't see another aspect that rule of law, especially including civil law, must be supported by all the members of the civil society and not just by the professional lawyers and specialists. I find here that the new factor has been added to the old corrupt iron triangle that is the academy represented by the powerful professors at University Tokyo like Sasaki, Uchida, and Omura. Now there is a new iron square composed of the corrupt politicians, inefficient bureaucrats, greedy businesses, and big-headed scholars. The majority of the Japanese elites are educated at University Tokyo. I'd called this new iron square the government of the University Tokyo for the University Tokyo by the University Tokyo, in which the common people are alienated. In addition, I'd like to point out that there are no alternatives more like Hashikawa and Aida, who were critical of the mainstreaming among the Japanese intellectuals. Finally, I'd like to pay attention to the global discussion related to this point. I'm confident that there is another way of democracy. I mean, there are intellectuals implementing critical thinking. This alternative movement among intellectuals is sometimes called left-wing. I think, however, it can be better characterized if we use the keywords of the third way or also postmodern. their common essence is the attitude to criticize the communist autocracy on the one hand, as well as the capitalistic disparity on the other hand, so as to advocate an open society arising from a democratic process. I'd like to mention only two authors. First, the British, Anthony Giddens, and second, the French, Jean-François Lyotard. Roughly seen, they share the common value like ecology, peace, safety, liberty, humanity, race, gender, minorities, tolerance, dialogue, diversity, and so on. There have been at least some political attempts to realize these ideas, for example, by the United States, Bill Clinton administration, the British Tony Blair administration, the German Gerhard Schröder administration. This trend is succeeded, for example, by the former US presidential candidate, Bernie Sanders. And it is remarkable that there is no equivalent movement among Japanese intellectuals, because most of the Japanese intellectuals want to participate in the mainstreaming of the technocratic discussion in order to get a research subsidy from the government. To conclude my discussion, Bob, I'd like to say that the Japanese democracy lacks the new tendency towards an open society in the form of the third way or also the postmodern. This means also that the Japanese intellectuals are integrated into the closed structure of Iron Square. Within this Iron Square, the elites can easily build up a face-to-face relationship among them, because all of them, namely the LDP politicians in Nagatacho, the bureaucrats in Kasumigaseki, the business persons in Marunouchi Nihonbashi, and the scholars at Todai in Ochanomizu, they are all staying within the 5-kilometer circle from the Imperial Palace, the center of Tokyo. Within this small circle, everything important in Japan is decided. However, this has not worked well for 3 decades, as I mentioned. Nevertheless, there are few elites being ready to listen to the legitimate criticism. I'm sure, facing this challenge, that we have to start breaking the closed structure so as to construct an open society for everyone. That is a society of the people, by the people, for the people. This should be the responsibility of all of the intellectuals in the current situation in Japan. This is all what I want to talk about. Yeah, thank you very much for your patience.